Student visa policies are changing quietly, but the effects are becoming visible across housing markets, universities, and entry-level job sectors. Governments are adjusting rules at the same time public language remains cautious and technical. What once looked like a harmless education pipeline is now being discussed as an economic pressure point. These shifts are not driven by hostility towards students, but by systems reaching their limits. To understand why governments are stepping back, you have to examine how student visas gradually took on a much larger role. For years, international student visas were treated as a uniquely convenient policy tool, bringing foreign funding, global talent, and soft power without triggering the political resistance attached to permanent immigration. Governments emphasized their temporary nature, while universities expanded enrollment to offset declining public funding and rising operating costs. As long as students were framed as short-term visitors, the system faced little scrutiny. Over time, however, scale changed function. International students did not just attend lectures, they rented apartments, entered local labor markets through part-time work, relied on transport and health services, and increasingly transitioned into post-study work routes. In major cities, student demand became a structural pillar of rental markets already constrained by limited supply. At the same time, universities grew financially dependent on international fees, turning enrollment growth from an option into a necessity. This created a quiet imbalance where education policy began absorbing pressures from housing shortages, labor gaps, and underfunded institutions. As rents climbed and entry-level jobs became more competitive, public frustration intensified, particularly among younger voters priced out of housing. Political leaders discovered that student inflows were no longer invisible to voters because their effects were no longer abstract. What once looked like a clean economic win now carried visible costs. Policymakers did not suddenly oppose international education, but they were forced to confront a system expanding faster than the infrastructure supporting it. Student visas stopped being a niche education issue and became a proxy for broader economic strain, placing governments in a position where adjustment felt unavoidable even if the trade-offs were politically uncomfortable. That shift marked the moment when review replaced expansion, caution replaced optimism, and student visa policy entered a phase where limits, conditions, and economic capacity began to matter more than growth alone across governments worldwide today increasingly. When a temporary education policy starts shaping housing and jobs, can governments still treat it as separate from immigration? As student numbers continued to rise, the pressure they placed on housing and entry-level labor markets became impossible for governments to ignore, even if officials avoided saying it directly. In many major cities, international students concentrated demand in already tight rental markets, often competing for the same small apartments and shared housing as local young workers. This pushed rents higher in specific neighborhoods, creating visible affordability problems that voters could directly feel. Unlike abstract economic indicators, rent increases show up immediately in household budgets, and politicians quickly learned that housing stress generates faster backlash than almost any other issue. At the same time, student visas allowed limited work rights, which meant international students entered part-time and casual job markets in retail, hospitality, and services. Individually, this was manageable, but at scale it intensified competition for entry-level work, especially during periods of slower economic growth. Employers benefited from a larger labor pool, but young domestic workers felt squeezed, particularly when wages failed to keep up with living costs. This created a perception problem for governments, because policies designed to support education were now being blamed for worsening housing shortages and job insecurity. The political challenge was not that student visas caused these problems alone, but that they amplified existing weaknesses in housing supply and labor markets. Once that connection entered public debate, student migration stopped being invisible. Opposition parties, local governments, and media narratives increasingly linked visa numbers to overcrowded cities, strained infrastructure, and declining quality of life. Even governments that supported international education found themselves under pressure to demonstrate control. Tightening visa rules became a way to signal responsiveness without confronting deeper structural failures like housing underbuilding or weak wage growth. This is how student visas shifted from being an administrative issue managed by education departments to a politically sensitive lever tied to elections, public sentiment, and urban stress. When voters associate a policy with rising rents and tougher job prospects, neutrality disappears, and caution replaces expansion as the default response. If housing and jobs drove the backlash, why did governments choose to limit visas instead of fixing the deeper problems first? Governments faced a difficult choice once student visas became politically sensitive, because the fastest response was not necessarily the most effective one. Expanding housing supply, reforming zoning laws, or raising productivity in low-wage sectors are complex tasks that take years and often face local resistance. Tightening visa rules, by contrast, is immediate, visible, and centrally controlled. It allows leaders to signal action without confronting entrenched interests or admitting past policy failures. This is why student visas increasingly became a pressure release valve for problems that originated elsewhere. Universities, however, were caught in the middle. Many institutions had structured their budgets around international tuition, using those funds to cross-subsidize domestic students, research, and infrastructure. When governments began discussing limits, universities warned of funding gaps, course closures, and reduced global competitiveness. Yet politically, defending universities was harder than defending voters struggling with rent. The result was a quiet shift in priorities, where economic optics outweighed institutional dependence. Governments began reframing student visas not as growth engines, but as numbers that needed managing. Language changed from opportunity to balance, from openness to sustainability. This reframing also reduced political risk. By presenting restrictions as technical adjustments rather than ideological shifts, policymakers avoided accusations of hostility while still slowing inflows. At the same time, responsibility was subtly redistributed. Housing shortages could now be discussed as demand issues rather than supply failures, and job competition could be blamed on inflows rather than weak wage growth. This narrative did not solve underlying problems, but it bought time. Student visa caps became a short-term stabilizer in a system under strain. However, every time governments rely on this tool, they reinforce the idea that education migration is conditional, flexible, and expendable. That realization changes how students, universities, and cities plan for the future, introducing uncertainty globally. If visa limits are the easiest solution, what long-term costs are governments quietly accepting by relying on them? Once governments began treating student visas as an adjustable economic lever, uncertainty became a defining feature of the system, and that uncertainty carries costs that are easy to overlook. International students make long-term decisions years in advance, choosing countries based on perceived stability, post-study opportunities, and the reliability of rules. When policies change frequently or signals become mixed, risk increases, and students respond by looking elsewhere. This shift does not happen overnight, but gradually, as trust erodes. Universities feel this first through slower applications, changing student demographics, and greater reliance on a smaller set of source countries, which increases vulnerability. Cities feel it next, as rental demand patterns become more volatile, affecting developers and local businesses that had adjusted to steady inflows. Over time, countries that once benefited from predictable education pipelines face a less stable ecosystem. Governments often underestimate this effect because the downside is delayed and diffuse. A cap introduced today may not reduce revenue or talent immediately, but it alters expectations. Education systems that were built around scale struggle to adapt to fluctuation. Research funding, course offerings, and global partnerships become harder to sustain when enrollment cannot be forecast with confidence. There is also a labor market dimension. Many economies quietly relied on international graduates to fill skill gaps, particularly in technology, healthcare, and engineering. Restricting student pathways narrows that channel, forcing employers to compete harder for domestic talent that may not be available at scale. This can slow growth, even as governments attempt to relieve pressure elsewhere. Politically, however, these trade-offs are easier to absorb because they do not trigger immediate backlash. Voters feel housing pressure quickly, but they feel talent shortages slowly. That asymmetry makes student visa tightening an attractive short-term move, even if it weakens long-term competitiveness. By choosing uncertainty over reform, governments reduce immediate strain while quietly reshaping their future workforce and education systems in ways that are difficult to reverse once alternative destinations absorb displaced demand. If uncertainty pushes students and talent elsewhere, which countries are quietly gaining from these policy shifts? As traditional destination countries tighten student visa rules, the global education market does not shrink, it reallocates. Students who face higher barriers in one country rarely abandon international study altogether. Instead, they redirect their plans toward destinations that signal stability, affordability, and clearer post-study pathways. This is how policy tightening in one place becomes an opportunity elsewhere. Countries with smaller education sectors but more flexible visa regimes begin attracting students who would previously have aimed for established hubs. These destinations often market predictability rather than prestige, emphasizing transparent rules, manageable living costs, and realistic work options after graduation. Over time, this reshapes global student flows in subtle but lasting ways. Universities in emerging destinations benefit from diversified enrollment and increased revenue without the same political scrutiny faced by larger systems. Local economies gain spending, labor market support, and long-term talent pipelines, all while avoiding the visibility that triggered backlash in larger cities. Governments in these countries learn from others' mistakes, often pairing student intake with regional development strategies to prevent housing and infrastructure bottlenecks. Meanwhile, countries that restrict visas may underestimate how quickly reputational damage spreads. Students share experiences, Agents adjust recommendations, and global rankings lose influence when policy risk rises. Even temporary measures can create lasting perceptions of instability. This competitive dynamic turns student migration into a strategic game where consistency matters as much as openness. The irony is that governments tightening visas often do so to protect domestic systems, yet in the process, they transfer economic and demographic advantages to competitors. Talent, tuition revenue, and future workers do not disappear. They move. Once alternative destinations establish credibility, reversing that flow becomes difficult. Students who build careers elsewhere form networks, contribute to innovation, and eventually influence global business and research patterns. What begins as a domestic pressure response slowly alters the international balance of education and skills. Policymakers focused on short-term relief may overlook how quickly global systems adapt, and how quietly advantages shift to those who offer clarity when others hesitate. If talent and revenue are relocating, how long can restrictive countries afford to trade stability for short-term relief? When student visa limits start replacing deeper reform, another problem emerges that governments rarely acknowledge. The policy begins shaping behavior across the entire system. Universities adjust admission strategies, prioritizing short-term revenue stability over long-term academic planning. Employers recalibrate hiring expectations, assuming international graduate pipelines will remain unreliable. Cities pause development decisions, unsure whether population growth will justify new housing or infrastructure. Over time, this uncertainty hardens into a planning paralysis that slows adaptation everywhere. Instead of fixing housing shortages, governments manage demand. Instead of improving productivity, they cap inputs. This creates a fragile equilibrium where pressure is controlled but never resolved. The longer this approach continues, the more student visas lose their original purpose as education pathways and become economic shock absorbers. That shift matters because shock absorbers wear out. When global conditions change, whether through demographic decline, recession, or technological transition, countries that narrowed their talent inflows discover they lack flexibility. Education systems struggle to scale back up. International reputation recovers slowly. Skills gaps widen just as innovation becomes more critical. Politically, reversing restrictive policies becomes difficult because success was measured by reduced pressure, not improved capacity. Any reopening risks being framed as irresponsible, even if economic conditions demand it. This is how temporary controls turn into structural constraints. Governments do not plan to rely on restriction indefinitely, but incentives push them in that direction. Each cycle of tightening makes the next easier and the cost of reform higher. In trying to protect stability, policymakers gradually trade resilience for control. If restriction becomes habit, can these systems still respond when growth becomes unavoidable? Once student visa restrictions begin delivering short-term political relief, incentives shift in a way that makes reversal increasingly unlikely. Housing pressure eases slightly, job competition appears less intense, and governments point to visible action without confronting harder reforms. These outcomes matter politically because voters respond to immediate conditions, not long-term capacity. As a result, success becomes defined by containment rather than improvement. Leaders who inherit these policies face the same incentives. Removing limits risks accusations of irresponsibility, even if underlying conditions have changed. Keeping them in place carries little immediate cost. Over time, this creates policy inertia. Student visa frameworks harden, not because they are optimal, but because they are politically safe. Bureaucracies adapt to enforcement rather than expansion, and public messaging shifts from openness to caution. Even when data suggests that restrictions are harming universities or employers, the political calculus favors stability over correction. This dynamic is reinforced by timing. Housing shortages and wage stagnation develop over decades, but elections occur every few years. Structural fixes rarely deliver results within a single political cycle, while visa limits do. That mismatch encourages leaders to prioritize tools that show quick impact. Meanwhile, responsibility diffuses. Housing ministries blame migration settings, education departments blame labor markets, and no single institution owns the full problem. Student visas become a convenient focal point where action is visible, but accountability is limited. The system locks itself in place not through conspiracy, but through aligned incentives. Each decision makes the next one easier, narrowing the range of acceptable policy choices. What began as temporary management quietly becomes the default framework. If political incentives reward control over reform, what force could realistically push governments to change course? Even when political incentives favor restriction, economic reality has a way of reasserting itself over time. Countries can manage pressure for a while by limiting student inflows, but underlying trends do not disappear. Aging populations reduce the domestic workforce, productivity growth remains weak, and demand for skilled labor continues to rise across technology, healthcare, and advanced services. When these gaps widen, the cost of restriction becomes harder to ignore. Employers struggle to hire, innovation slows, and economic growth loses momentum. Unlike housing pressure, which is visible and immediate, talent shortages emerge gradually, but once they appear, they are difficult to reverse quickly. Education systems cannot instantly produce skilled workers at scale, and retraining takes years. This is when governments begin facing a new trade-off. Maintaining tight controls protects short-term political stability, but it undermines long-term economic capacity. Countries that once relied on international graduates to support growth find themselves competing more aggressively for a shrinking pool of domestic talent. Wages rise in some sectors, but productivity does not always follow, increasing inflationary pressure instead of sustainable growth. At the same time, competitor countries that remained open benefit from accumulated talent, stronger research networks, and deeper labor markets. This divergence compounds over time. What initially looked like responsible management starts to resemble self-limitation. Policymakers are then forced to reconsider assumptions they previously avoided. Student visas, once treated as a pressure release tool, reappear as a growth lever that was prematurely constrained. The challenge is that rebuilding trust and reopening pathways is slower than closing them. By the time economic signals demand change, systems have already adjusted to restriction, making reversal politically and administratively complex. When growth pressures return, will governments be able to reopen pathways fast enough to respond? When governments finally recognize that restrictions have gone too far, timing becomes the most critical risk. Reopening student visa pathways is not like flipping a switch, because international education depends heavily on trust, predictability, and long planning cycles. Students choose destinations years in advance, agents adjust recommendations slowly, and universities build recruitment strategies around stable assumptions. If a country signals openness after a period of tightening, the response is rarely immediate. Many potential students will already have committed elsewhere, while institutions may lack the capacity or confidence to scale back up quickly. This lag creates a vulnerability window where economic needs rise faster than inflows can recover. Employers feel this gap acutely as skill shortages persist, projects are delayed, and competitiveness erodes. Governments may respond by loosening rules abruptly, but sudden shifts carry their own risks. Rapid expansion can overwhelm housing and infrastructure again, reigniting the very pressures that triggered restrictions in the first place. This cycle of tightening and loosening undermines credibility and reinforces uncertainty. Meanwhile, countries that maintained consistent policies continue compounding advantages. Their education systems mature, their cities adapt gradually, and their labor markets integrate international graduates more smoothly. Over time, these differences widen. The cost of reopening late is not just lost students in a single year, but lost networks, innovation spillovers, and long-term demographic support. Policymakers often underestimate how competitive the global education market has become. Students are not waiting for policy reversals, they are making choices in real time. Once flows shift and settle, reclaiming position requires sustained commitment rather than temporary signals. If reopening too late carries its own risks, how do governments decide when pressure outweighs caution? Eventually, governments reach a point where managing pressure is no longer enough, because the trade-off they tried to postpone becomes unavoidable. Student visa policy sits at the intersection of two competing realities: the need for political stability today and the need for economic capacity tomorrow. Restricting inflows can reduce visible stress in housing and entry-level jobs, but it also limits future growth, talent renewal, and institutional resilience. Keeping pathways open supports universities, innovation, and demographic balance, but it demands parallel investment in housing, infrastructure, and productivity that many governments delayed for too long. This is why student visas became a proxy battleground. They were easier to adjust than zoning laws, wage systems, or long-term planning failures. But proxies eventually reveal their limits. The longer governments rely on restriction to manage strain, the harder it becomes to rebuild systems capable of absorbing growth. At the same time, reopening without preparation risks repeating the same cycle of backlash and tightening. The real solution was never fully open or fully closed. It required alignment between education policy, housing supply, labor markets, and public investment, something few countries achieved when conditions were favorable. Now, decisions carry higher costs and narrower margins. Student visas did not cause these pressures, but they exposed them. How governments respond next will shape not only education systems, but long-term competitiveness and social stability. This moment is less about students and more about whether political systems can move beyond short-term control towards sustainable capacity. The outcome will not be dramatic or immediate, but it will quietly determine which countries adapt and which fall behind. When managing pressure is no longer enough, are governments prepared to confront the deeper choices they postponed? If you want to understand how these quiet policy shifts shape the global economy long before headlines catch up, stay with the channel.